Order, order. Ms Diane Abbott to move the motion.
I beg to move that this House has considered the vital subject of air pollution in London. And I want to begin by saying what a pleasure it is to serve under your chairmanship, Mr Coulsby, and to congratulate those members who have turned up at this early hour for what is actually a vital subject for the people of London. I want to begin by urging the House to take notice of the unseen, silent killer stalking London streets. A killer unknowingly encountered by every single Londoner every single day. It's present when you drop your children off at school, it's present when you make your journey to and from work, it follows you throughout your weekends in the city, and this malign presence is the noxious fumes that pollute the air we breathe. Specifically, this killer is made up of two components: particulate matter, comprised of solid and liquid particles, and gases such as nitrogen dioxide. And in London, the primary culprit for these killer chemicals is road traffic. So while industry is nationwide the biggest source of pollution, in urban environments like London, where the accumulation of pollution and related health impact is greatest, road traffic is responsible for up to 70% of all their air pollution. And Londoners are dying as a result. Across the capital in 2008, over 4,000 premature deaths were a direct result of deadly levels of air pollution. In every year since then, thousands of Londoners have lost and continue to lose their lives early simply because the air they breathe is slowly poisoning them.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way and congratulate her on securing this important debate. Given the stretch of the A406 through my constituency has one of the highest levels of nitrogen dioxide in the city, surpassed only by central London, and that Public Health England have linked air pollution to 7% of deaths in the London borough of Redbridge, would my honourable friend agree with me that more needs to be done to tackle this problem, particularly in terms of congestion around Charlie Brown's roundabout and Redbridge roundabout as a matter of urgency?
I entirely agree with my honourable friend, and later on in my remarks I will come to how Boris, the current mayor, and actually this government, has failed Londoners, including his constituents, on this important matter of air pollution.
I'm grateful to the honourable lady when I congratulate her on securing this debate. It certainly is an issue that needs greater prominence. Would the honourable lady be aware, though, of the impact that London's pollution can have on the surrounding areas as well? For example, in my constituency in Dartford, the westerly winds blow pollution from London onto the problems that already exist in areas like Dartford from the M25, which add to the bronchial and respiratory conditions that are suffered by local residents in those areas too.
I thank the honourable member for that very important point. As a prospective candidate for Mayor of London, you'll forgive me if I talk about London, but it's important that the House is reminded that the high levels of pollution in London have an effect on the surrounding areas.
Very grateful, and I indeed congratulate the honourable member for securing this debate, and I'm pleased that it builds upon the work of the Environmental Audit Select Committee in the last Parliament. And while the honourable member may well be a candidate for the Mayor of London, and if she was elected, she would be able to play her part in this, does she not also agree that local authorities also have a significant role in their part in actually addressing air quality in their boroughs?
I entirely agree that local authorities have a significant role, and if I were Mayor of London, I would be trying to bring them together and offer leadership on this question. It's not just a matter for the Mayor, not just a matter for government, it's also a matter for local authorities and also the personal choices we make about our travel and our children's lives. Already this year, according to the latest research, up to 1,300 people have died across the city, with the Clean Air London campaign group arguing that over 7,000 Londoners a year are now dying prematurely as a result of toxic air. It is well established that toxic air is a direct cause of bronchitis, asthma, strokes, even cancer and heart disease. And I think we all recognise that the level of childhood asthma we see now is far higher than any of us knew when we were young people at school. And I cannot believe there is no connection between the very high levels of childhood asthma and the rising levels of air pollution.
I thank my honourable friend for, again, securing this debate, and also to thank the Clean Air London campaigners, Simon Burkett and others, for their work. She's making a very important point about children's asthma and respiratory issues, and a comment about the local authorities was just made. Does she also agree that it's important to raise the public awareness of where there can be higher concentrations of air pollution, for example, by roadsides and even lower down because of the density of pollution that can affect children in prams much more, and therefore their access to and breathing in of pollution?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for her point, and I entirely agree with her. And when I think of the number of primary schools in Stoke Newington, which are literally alongside heavily used main roads, you do wonder about the health of the children that have to attend those schools. So as I've said, young people in our city are particularly vulnerable to the effects of air pollution. Children growing up or attending primary school near the noxious fumes of busy roads has been clinically proven to develop smaller lung capacity and increased susceptibility to respiratory infections. Everyday exposure to air pollution, as you get when you walk to school and back every day, has been found to contribute to increased inflammation of the airways in healthy children, not to mention in children already suffering from asthma. And these chronically debilitating issues lead to serious medical problems that will stay with them for the rest of their lives. And I would say to the Minister at this point, given the particularly damaging impact air pollution has on children's lungs, and we have a duty of care to children. Adults can make choices about whether they drive to work or cycle or walk, but we have a particular duty of care to children. So I ask the Minister why the government is not doing more to support the production and dissemination of accurate, practical advice for schools to help them reduce the impact pollution is having on the health and well-being of London's children and further afield. Awareness is key, and I would argue the government is failing in its duty to raise awareness. Those with respiratory and cardiovascular disease are at greater risk of worsening their conditions from the adverse effects of air pollution. As a whole, London has very high rates of respiratory disease and cardiovascular disease, not least in Hackney. Our most vulnerable are at risk, and not enough is being done to protect them. Now,
I thank her for giving way on that point. Would she agree with me? She's referred to the action the government needs to take, but also, of course, in London, isn't it the case that Transport for London have a very large communications budget, and they could and should be using that to publicise much more effectively concerns around air quality and incidences of air quality issues in London?
When I refer to the role of the Mayor, I am of course referring to the entire GLA family over which the Mayor sits, which includes TFL, which includes the Metropolitan Police and the Fire Brigade. So now's the time for action. It is completely unacceptable that London's air is the filthiest of any European capital, while the level of air pollution found on Oxford Street ensures that it has the unwelcome honour of ranking amongst the most polluted streets in the entire world.
I was making an excellent speech about the problems, particularly with schools. I had some of the most polluted roads, A4, A40, Hammersmith Broadway, with schools alongside them. But I wonder, in addition to central London, if she's going to talk about the other big problem in London, which is Heathrow, which also breaks EU limits. Does she agree with me that the worst thing we could do is to increase the size of Heathrow by 50%, the third runway, and make that even more illegal than it currently is, and make it an even worse environmental danger?
My friend anticipates a later part of my speech. But there's no question that aviation is a major cause of pollutants, and you have to touch on that if you're offering solutions to this problem. So we have in London the filthiest air of any European capital. The need to improve air quality is recognised in EU legislation, which sets limits for a range of pollutants. And as part of this legislation, member states were required to prepare adequate plans to reduce nitrogen dioxide to acceptable levels by 2015, and the UK has failed to do so. DEFRA estimates that in the Greater London area, these limits, which I was perfectly aware of, will not be met until after 2030.
Oh, will my honourable friend give me? I'd like to echo other members that have, thank you, Mr. Chairman, who've congratulated the honourable member for securing this important debate on this vital subject. You mentioned Oxford Street. I mean, there are also suburban equivalents. The Horn Lane in Acton off the A40 is one of the most polluted hotspots of West London. And it's Asthma UK, a neutral charity, who's called the government's approach, quote unquote, designed to mask the true scale of England's air quality crisis rather than make any real attempt to solve it. So, I mean, I know you said that you would come round to what the Mayor of London is doing, but I mean, the record on this is quite atrocious. I mean, some of the things they've been doing, trying to glue down air particulates near the air quality sensors, and also failing to create the network of electric car charging points that were meant to be done. And also that ultra-low emission zone is so far in the future, it's not going to help anything in the immediate term.
I congratulate my friend on her important intervention, which deserved to be made at length. So we've got this delayed programme for meeting EU targets, and I would like to ask the Minister to estimate how many Londoners will die as a result between now and 2030. And I think one of the most shaming things, as a result of the government's abject failure to meet the EU targets, a UK charity, Client Earth, had to take the government to court. And after referring to the EU Court of Justice, the Supreme Court here in the UK has ordered the government to submit new air quality plans to the European Commission no later than December 31st of this year. We had to be taken to court on this before the government came up with sustainable proposals. And I'd like to ask the Minister, why did it take the Supreme Court for the government and the Mayor of London to take the deadly matter of air pollution seriously? It's not the provision of a clean living environment a basic duty to be fulfilled by any government? And won't he admit that on a wider scale, this government is culpable of gross negligence that is leading to the premature death nationwide of up to 30,000 UK residents? And if the human cost doesn't move the Minister, then perhaps as the government busies itself with its latest rounds of cuts to vital public services, would the Minister even stop to consider that we spend 16 billion a year treating the adverse effects of air pollution? If the human cost doesn't bother the government, it ought to bother the government the actual financial costs incurred by these levels of air pollution. So for us here in London, it's essential that air pollution is tackled as a matter of urgency. In many locations across the city, levels regularly exceed EU limits of pollutants by a multiple of 2 or 3. To put into perspective the severity of the situation, Oxford Street managed to breach the nitrogen dioxide hourly limit for the whole of 2015. They've got a limit for the whole of 2015, and they had breached it by the 4th of January. I repeat, the hourly limit for the whole of 2015 was breached in just 4 days. Each and every Londoner suffers on a daily basis of this continued inaction. So, the responsibility to address London's air pollution scandal rests with central government, with the Mayor, and local authorities also have a role to play. As a starting point, I'd urge a new cross-departmental government strategy is implemented in order to bring about change and reduce air pollution's impact on public health. This cross-departmental strategy should involve Public Health England and non-governmental bodies such as NHS England. It is essential that such a strategy should include clear, measurable and time-bound objective relating to the reduction of emission levels, costs and health benefits, which up until now, previous strategies have sorely lacked. It should become mandatory that all local authorities are required to monitor levels of smaller particulate matter as they are already bound to monitor nitrogen dioxide and PM10. We must see the results being published regularly and accessibly so Londoners can remain fully informed about the dangers to their health and the health of their children. In addition, early alerts from DEFRA and the Met Office are crucial to guarantee that those most at risk from polluted air are able to plan in advance and avoid the symptoms. And both organisations should continue to develop links with organisations such as the British Lung Foundation, who are well placed to get the information out to at-risk groups. In relation to the role and the inactivity of the current mayor, I believe that with his direct executive powers over TfL, Boris Johnson is...
Congratulate her on securing the debate, and before she gets on to the mayor, is there not one omission from the list of responsibilities on central government, which is the ultimate no-brainer policy, which is to avoid willfully increasing traffic on existing pollution hotspots? The third runway decision has already been cited, but the existing plans for the construction of HS2 on DEFRA's own modelling will increase emissions of the most dangerous pollutants in my constituency by 40%. And isn't that not gross irresponsibility?
My honourable member makes a very important point. Throughout the current mayor's tenure, there has been a growing gap between what he has said on the issue of air pollution and what he has done on the issue. That is not unsurprising. Boris Johnson is a politician who talks a good game, but doesn't necessarily deliver. One example of this is the introduction of ultra-low emission zones that would require vehicles travelling to central London to meet stricter emission standards or pay a daily charge. Now, since proposing the ultra-low zone fully 2 years ago, Boris Johnson has taken a series of backward steps. His approach to this issue is inadmissibly weak. Waiting until 2020 to introduce the zone is a move that is quite simply costing lives. A range of organisations, the London Boroughs, the London Health Commission, the Faculty of Public Health, the Royal College of Physicians, have come together to call for the ultra-low emission zone to be strengthened, early implementation, wider coverage, stricter standards, stronger incentives, but from Mayor Boris Johnson we hear nothing. The financial cost to a fraction of drivers and voters must be weighed against the health benefits to those same drivers who actually are the most at risk from pollution, and to the larger population, particularly children, who are exposed to air pollution in central London and beyond, all the way to Dartford. Furthermore, Boris Johnson has paid no heed to the fundings of the Marmot Review of Health Inequalities, which made the link between the higher exposure to air pollution amongst poorer communities and the increased risk of cardiorespiratory disease. Indeed, nationwide, 66% of man-made carcinogenic chemicals are released into the air in the most deprived 10% of English city wards. So, it's imperative that an incoming mayor, who I hope will be myself, will widen the scope of measures and schemes designed to take pollution measures. And by restricting its focus to central London and Zone 1, Boris Johnson has abdicated responsibility to those most vulnerable by excluding those in densely populated, heavily polluted and disadvantaged areas, and no thought at all for areas outside London who are also affected by the high levels of air pollution in London. So, I think Londoners deserve, and I want, London to become the world's greenest capital city. So the solutions going forward are as follows. We cannot fight the environmental challenges facing London, including air pollution, in a silo. We need a mayor of London that would advocate ideas on sustainability, low energy consumption and efficient waste production, reproduction, which would permeate planning in all sectors, in housing and transport and healthcare, education and business. Not all of London's air quality issues are the result of the number of motor vehicles on our roads, but reducing their numbers and cleaning up their fuel sources will lead to big improvements. An incoming mayor must incentivise the use of electric cars, work actively to reduce the number of diesel vehicles on our roads. With London's population growing year on year, our city is at a crossroads on the issue of the environment in general and air pollution in particular. Londoners must make a choice as to whether they want a change for the better. Cleaner air, increased reliance on renewable energy, a safer city for cyclists and pedestrians is an achievable reality with the right political will. I would contend the current mayor has not shown that political will. An incoming mayor must take urgent action. It is unacceptable, for instance, that statistics from 2013 shows that the City of London has the highest carbon footprint per person in the whole of the UK. Whereas the average Briton produces 12.5 tonnes of carbon dioxide a year, emissions per head in the city are 25% higher. Maybe it's because they're more important, maybe it's because they're more wealthy, but it is not acceptable. I think the mayor should be looking at the use of sustainable technologies. I went to a very interesting project in Hackney a week or so ago where they've put solar panels on top of a big council block, which is enabling them to get their electricity more cheaply, but is also a sustainable energy source. And I think that's a very interesting project which could potentially be rolled out across London. So current efforts are not sufficient. Not enough progress has been made to increase the number of hybrid buses within TfL's fleet, and rectifying this should be treated as a priority. The fact that Oxford Street remains one of the most polluted streets in the world is evidence that measures to reduce pollution emitting from taxis and buses are not being pursued with sufficient energy. We need to establish more accessible grants for environmentally friendly infrastructure development. London can become a global leader in the proliferation of renewable energy sources like solar power. London would do well to adopt such good practices as the creation of last-mile delivery hubs to ensure the carbon footprint of final stage delivery is minimised. There are firms in the city encouraging their employees to, if not walk to work, walk between offices. We need the improvement of London's sustainable infrastructure, which would create jobs in construction and logistics. In London, solving London's housing crisis, the environmental future of our city must be incorporated in terms of its sustainability and environmentally friendly projects. For instance, housing developments that incorporate super insulation would help reduce the ever-increasing energy bills for London. We also need to step up our levels to make the city a safe, accessible place for cyclists. If more people could be encouraged to drop their cars and get on their bikes, London would be a more green and a more livable city. Not enough has been done to address this, and it should be treated as an urgent necessity. In conclusion, there is no doubt that members on both sides of the House understand that this is an important issue which has not been properly addressed. There can be no doubt that the airport expansion that is talked about at Heathrow would be the death knell of efforts to improve levels of air pollution, because aviation is such a major cause of air pollution. Toxic air in London is killing Londoners. We need urgent measures to tackle it. Promises to meet EU guidelines by 2025 or even 2030 are unacceptable, and it is shocking that it's taken direct action from the Supreme Court to force the Governor and the Mayor to seriously address this issue. What is clear is we have a real opportunity to tackle air pollution through a wholesale shift in the way we view our living environment. For London and for Londoners and for the wider population in the UK, it's imperative we seize the initiative and put an end to this silent killer once and for all. And I am using the opportunity of this debate to urge all the stakeholders to step up to their responsibility. Individual companies that can encourage sustainable travel by their employees. Housing developers who can encourage sustainable development which uses renewable energy. Borough councils that can do more to encourage cycling to school and to give out information about air pollution. The Mayor of London, who I think we can agree has comprehensively failed on this issue, and the government. People should not have had to go to court to force the government to recognise its responsibilities under EU legislation. This is an important issue which is not being dealt with. As we fail to deal with it, thousands of Londoners die every year, and I'm very grateful to the House to have had the opportunity to bring this issue to the attention of members.
The question is that this House has considered the effect of air pollution in London. Before I start to call members, I intend to call the front benches about 10:30. So we have 35 minutes, and there are a number of speakers. So I'm not going to impose a time limit, but if members could keep their contributions to under 5 minutes and probably around 4, then we'll probably get everyone in. John MacDonald.
Very briefly, I want to raise 3 issues, because I actually think all levels of government have failed my constituents and have failed London overall. In terms of central government, let's make it absolutely clear, there is no way that the government can abide by the European directives on air pollution if a third runway goes ahead. We already have the admission by Heathrow Limited now, for the first time, despite us arguing this for 4 decades, they now admit 4,000 properties in my constituency will be rendered unlivable or be demolished as a result of the expansion of Heathrow Airport caused by air pollution or noise pollution. That's 10,000 people being forced out of their homes. In addition to all of that, in every inquiry we've had on Heathrow expansion up until now, particularly before the last one, we've been told that inevitably air pollution will be reduced by the technological improvements with regard to aircrafts themselves. In fact, when we had, before the last general election, the argument for the third runway was comforted by this new aircraft that was being developed that was noise-free and air pollution-free as well. We then discovered not only is that no such aircraft even envisaged, it wasn't even on the drawing boards. We're now told again, fictitiously, I believe, that there'll be a whole range of mitigation measures that will be introduced if a third runway goes ahead, which will mean not only will we cap the levels of air pollution, we will reduce them, become compliant with European Union legislation. No one believes that in the scientific world.
I never believed any of the promises that Heathrow have made over the last 20 years. I don't know why we should start now. But even if they were right about quieter aircraft, one of the major causes of pollution is, of course, the road traffic.
Exactly.
If you increase by 50% the number of flights, you're going to increase by 50% the number of cars driving to Heathrow, and that is a killer itself on the very roads which are most polluted in London.
And what worries me, when we presented this evidence to the Airports Commission, the Davis Commission, I think it was treated relatively truculently. And it was only the legal action that forced the Airports Commission to then consult again around air pollution. And in consulting, undermined the government's own guidelines about how to consult, the timescale and the appropriate way in which they consulted. So I believe actually now the Airports Commission report will be tainted as a result of their failure to deal with this particular matter correctly. The reality is, if you expand Heathrow Airport, we'll never be able to comply with air pollution limits as a result of just the aircraft and the road traffic that will be generated as a result. So therefore, the conclusion must be in government that Heathrow expansion cannot go ahead. If it does, it flies in the face, as I said, of all scientific evidence. The other failure of government, to be frank, is exactly as has been said, is the mayoral strategies. The mayoral strategies have been coming up with all sorts of different devices, air quality management zones. They've happened in my area, and they've been completely undermined by individual planning decisions, both supported by the mayor, by the planning inspectorate, and by local councils themselves. And I just give 2 examples in my area, and then I'll allow others to speak. The first is the Conway bitumen plant development. In my constituency, for a number of years, we've had the Nestles factory that has been pumping out emissions over the years, and we've been working cooperatively with them to reduce the air pollution that comes from that plant. In fact, when you wake up in the morning, you can smell coffee if the wind's in the right direction. It's a whole new meaning to wake up and smell the coffee. But to give Nestles their due, they worked over the years, they reduced the emissions, they worked with the local community. I set up a consultative group. They're now closing. But what then happens is that the local Hillingdon Council gives permission for Conways, a bitumen recycling plant, to be developed less than half a mile away. We are now exposed to fumes from that plant on a regular basis. It is not controlled by the local authority, because what's happened is the cutbacks in local government expenditure has meant Hillingdon have cut the staff, the environmental concerns and planning concerns are not being addressed effectively. The only reports on monitoring of this company is actually produced by the company themselves, which of course tells us they're compliant with all the legislation. I now have constituents, and my honourable friend from South Aldersville have constituents, who wake up in the morning as a result of the smell of the bitumen are nauseous, are sick as a result of it. It is overpowering, and yet we fail to be able to act as a result of the local council not being effective in delivering on its duties. I'd welcome a meeting with the Minister's officials just to take advice on how we go forward on that particular one. In the same area, which is an air quality management zone, the planning inspectorate then allows an out-of-town shopping development, an Asda, a huge site development, 500 car parking spaces, and therefore in that very road, North Hyde Road now, we will have at one end a bitumen plant pumping out emissions, at the other end an Asda development where there will be, I should think, anything like 10,000 traffic movements a day on that particular road. This is the way in which central government fails us. The mayoralty, to be frank, is proved to be completely ineffective. The local council either doesn't perform its duties effectively because of resulting cuts, but also the planning inspector overrides his decisions when they make them sensibly. There's something wrong here. I'll give up way to them.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. As a fellow Hillingdon MP, we stand shoulder to shoulder on the third runway. Will he agree with me, though, that the other great threat to quality of air in Hillingdon is the construction of HS2? And would he join me in pressing the government to look more seriously at the option of extending the tunnel to spare us the problem?
Well, what's interesting, I've always backed high-speed rail in... I was with this final sentence, I apologise for that. The honourable member basically is correct. I've supported high-speed rail as a concept for a large number of years, but we then discover HS2 actually generates more traffic in our area than it actually reduces and overcomes some of the problems we have at Heathrow. I think what I'm saying in final sentence, government, local government and the mayoralty need to get their act together on this. Last year I supported the call from the Environmental Audit Commission for a proper inquiry into the solutions to air pollution in London. We need it now and we need it urgently.
Mark Field.
Thank you, Mr. Crosby. I congratulate the Honourable Lady for Hackney North and Stoke Newington on her mayoral manifesto. Introducing the support close to all of our hearts. And for the avoidance of any doubt, Oxford Street is actually in my constituency. It may one day go into hers, perhaps, but I also have a lot to say, and she's quite right about the particular problems on that particular thoroughfare. I'm the father of two young children living in the increasingly congested Victoria Station district, and the issue therefore of air quality to everyday living is very critical. London is the largest, most established post-industrial city in Europe. Unsurprisingly, of course, many competing interests do jostle with air quality for priority. As we know, our capital is very proud to be a global city and is the epicentre of the UK's economy. For it to thrive does require constant new investment in all of our transport infrastructure, including, at times, roads. Only then can London maintain its position as a global leader. More than 1 million people come to work in my own constituency alone every day, and that congestion inevitably has a major impact on local air quality. The 10-year age limit on taxis from 2020 should be welcomed, as these vehicles are responsible for a relatively large proportion of the emissions in central London. I think it's also essential we have a taxi scrappage scheme that is introduced to help the drivers upgrade their vehicles. I think it's worth giving some praise to TfL with their efforts surrounding the ultra-low emission zones, which are set to be introduced. Perhaps it is a little bit further in the distance than many of us would like, introduced in 2020, and the investment that will encourage pedestrian electric cars and cycle lanes. But I fear it is insufficiently radical properly to address the heart of this issue. Now, in a bid to tackle climate change, successive governments have, through taxation, incentivised drivers to switch to diesel on the basis that it produces less carbon dioxide than petrol. I'm very sorry that this has helped compound the problem. The lobby group Clean Air in London, led by my own indefatigable constituent and actually good personal friend, Simon Burkitt, is and continues to claim to campaign for a new Clean Air Act to deal with diesel fumes, which do emit some 20 times the polluting particulates of their petrol equivalent. Clean Air London are rightly calling for a scrappage scheme to remove diesel vehicles from our roads and a widening of the congestion charge beyond London, with charges set purely on the basis of emission levels. Diesel vehicles may need to be charged far more to drive through the most polluted areas during the rush hour, and the ultra-low emission zone should, I think, be expanded to include the heavily congested north and south corridors. Diesel engines, I'm afraid, are dismally failing to meet nitrogen dioxide emission standards by an average of some 4.4 times per kilometre in real-world driving conditions. Much of this, I'm afraid, is caused by the impact of congestion and speed humps, which I'm afraid inexplicably have not variance in the industry standard norms. So as a result, nitrogen dioxide levels soar whenever an accelerator is used on a car. This, of course, is borne out by the UK being in breach of the EU's mandated air pollution levels for nitrogen dioxide in no fewer than 38 of the 43 air quality monitoring zones. These were meant to have been met, as the Honourable Lady pointed out, some 5 years ago, and of course have triggered the legal action to which she referred. Paradoxically, I would suggest that it's the EU-wide regulatory failing of diesel engine emissions that has led to much of this problem. Within my own constituency, we have a number of hotspots, not just Oxford Street, actually, Marylebone Road, in parts of Knightsbridge, and, as I said, around Victoria. Previously, these areas have the highest nitrogen dioxide levels in the world and really are causing some major problems. Clean Air in London are rightly calling for Oxford Street to be pedestrianised to a large extent and for shops and offices to be fitted with regularly maintained air filters to help reduce the nitrogen dioxide levels. And I'm told the regulations for issuing the fixed penalty notices for unnecessary idling of vehicle engines have so far proved, I'm afraid, ineffective, and that needs to change. The Honourable Lady also pointed out the City of London, which suffers from the highest levels of air pollution than average. And we only saw the campaign recently in the Evening Standard only last Friday that the city were advising people not to go jogging during the day because of the levels of pollution. This, of course, I've got much more I'd like to say, but I do appreciate other members also want to say a little bit more. May I just, if I may, finish off by saying that one of my own favourite hobbies is to walk in all corners of London. And I know from personal experience, I've been to Dalston and to Stamford Hill and the other parts of the Honourable Lady's constituency, which are less polluted than bits of mine, but nonetheless there is a pollution issue there as well. The problems to which we refer are not by any means limited either to the city centre or indeed to the area around Heathrow Airport, which I'm sure will be an important issue for many fellow London MPs. I dread to think of the damage that is being done to lungs of huge numbers of children and asthma sufferers, of whom there are now a staggering 5.4 million in the UK. I'm delighted this debate appears to be building momentum across the media. I want to give particular credit to the Evening Standard. I think their campaign is an important one and will run for months and years to come. And I just do hope the Minister will give very serious attention to a lot of what is being said here today, because this is a major issue and will be for all Londoners, and one that will unite the political class, I think, within London, across the House here, and something that we need to deal with some urgency.
No one up to now has been near 5 minutes, never mind 4, but I'm now going to call Tom Brake, who I'm sure will comply.
Crosby, I will do my best, and I'd like to congratulate the Honourable Lady for securing this very important debate. And I'd like to start by congratulating my a friend, Stephen Knight, who's a London Assembly member for the Lib Dems, who's focused on the issue of air quality around schools. And he did a survey which found that only 2% of teachers in schools were, for instance, aware of a service called Air Text, which provides updates to people if air quality is poor. And I understand that the Mayor has got a target of signing up 250,000 people to this service and is currently, I think, at 7,000, so has clearly got quite a long way to go before he hits that target. And I hope he will, because people need to know the information. Also, only 5% of teachers were aware of the Cleaner Air for Schools initiative supported by the Mayor. So as I highlighted in an earlier intervention, I think there's a lot more that the Mayor should be doing in relation to information about air quality. And whether you listen to LBC or read the Metro or go through the tube stations, you will often see adverts for TfL, and it's a huge organisation with a very large budget, and they should be doing much more to prioritise communicating about air pollution. They can do that through their websites, emails and paid commercials. And given that I think the GLA website has 200,000 visits a month, and the TfL website no less than 20 million per month. There are lots of opportunities for the Mayor to do more in terms of communicating. I do welcome what the Mayor is doing in relation to the ultra-low emission zones zone. However, I do wonder whether, according to the Supreme Court, doing this by 2020 will in fact be quick enough. We need to see incentives to encourage. The Mayor, I think, first announced this in 2008, that incentives would be available for taxis to switch to cleaner vehicles. We're now 7 years on and we're still waiting. There is an area where I think that the government and the Mayor can play an important role, and that is in relation to Euro 6, the Euro 6 standard lorries, which are already available. I was talking to a local removals firm of mine, Steve Freeze, and they have to rely on second-hand vehicles, and their worry is that in advance of 2020, when they will have to have these vehicles, that there won't in fact be enough second-hand vehicles on the market to enable them to purchase appropriate vehicles. I want to very briefly touch on a slightly different issue, and that's the issue of air quality in Beddington Lane in my constituency. And there is a proposal from Viridor to build an energy recovery facility on that site, which has lots of opposition locally, but the opponents don't seem to be articulating an alternative solution other than possibly trucking the waste much, much further than it currently goes. The issue that I want to ask the Minister to respond to at the end of this is just on whether the government intends supporting a methodology that would allow the Environment Agency to control the total emissions from a range of sources rather than simply linking the extra emissions associated with one site with the background pollution levels, because at the moment my understanding is that is how they have to handle things, but in Beddington Lane there are lots of facilities that are emitting, and it's actually the totality of what is happening that needs to be addressed. I would have loved to have talked about Heathrow as well, Mr Crosby, but I think you're encouraging me to sit down. Thank you.
Zach Goldsmith.
Thank you very much, Mr Crosby. It's a pleasure to speak under your chairmanship, and I'd like to congratulate the honourable member for initiating this crucial debate. The Great Smog of '52 killed around 3,500 people directly. Indirectly, we know it killed many more. And the public outcry led to the hugely successful, almost revolutionary Clean Air Act. Well, next year will be its 60th anniversary, has already been said, and air pollution is very much back as a significant public health issue. I won't go through all the bad news because it's already been relayed to you, but just one point, that more than 1 million Londoners today live in areas that exceed legal limits on NO2, ought to be enough to really highlight how important this issue is. And as London expands, its population is expected to hit around 10 million by 2030. The problem inevitably will grow, and tackling it is going to require the same level of energy that stopped the 1950s smog. Now, despite some of the things that have been said, I think we have seen leadership from the Mayor. For example, no other city in the world has a congestion charge and a low emission zone, or plans for an ultra low emission zone. I accept that there is a case for the ultra low emission zone to be brought forward and to be bigger. And there's a very strong case for that. We've seen a record investment in cycling over recent years in London, and take-up has radically increased. But given that we can't invent more roads, we're going to need those trends to ramp up massively if we want to avoid absolute gridlock on our streets. And for the same reason, we should be investing in infrastructure to make far greater use of the river to carry freight and, for that matter, people. The numbers have improved in recent years, but they need to be ramped up dramatically again. London is growing by the equivalent of 2 extra tube trains per week. I think the equivalent of 1 bus every 2 hours. So it's hard to exaggerate the case also for expanding our rail and tube network. But we also need a revolution in electric car ownership, and extraordinary really that despite falling costs, despite the fact that getting around in electric cars is dramatically cheaper than getting around in conventional alternatives, and despite the fact that there are 1,400 new charging points in the last 3 years, I believe, as a consequence of the Mayor's intervention, that revolution simply hasn't happened. It will, inevitably, the market dictates that it will, but the market, in my view, needs a boost. And the economics today are already such that there is no reason why new minicabs shouldn't all be electric or zero emission, or why companies with big fleets, delivery companies, for example, aren't automatically replacing their old vehicles with electric alternatives. The maths already stacks up, but somewhere along the line we need a very powerful nudge. And buses too. I believe London has the largest electric hybrid bus fleet in Europe, but the vast majority of London buses are still diesel, and many cities, including New York and Rome, have introduced whole fleets of electric buses. And we just have to ask how long before all our buses in London are electric, or at least a zero emission in other forms. Construction equipment too, diggers, for example, I only learnt this recently, account for a staggering 14% of particulate emissions in London. So surely contracts should only be awarded to construction companies where these engines have been retrofitted or where the vehicles are new and clean. There is masses we can do. I haven't got time to go through the full list. There's masses we can do in London, but central government also must play a role. For example, Denmark and France have both introduced highly successful fee-based schemes where a new tax is placed at the point of purchase on the dirtiest cars, with all the proceeds being used to bring down the cost of the cleanest alternatives. It's revenue neutral, it is not retrospective, it's popular, and it works. And while I'm on the subject of central government, and without wanting to repeat too much of what's already been said, although I'm loving the consensus, we must also emphasise that if we are serious about air quality, the government simply has to rule out Heathrow expansion. Heathrow is already in breach of legally binding air quality limits. Any expansion would make that far worse. And actually, DEFRA has just produced data showing that even without expansion, Heathrow is likely to be the second most polluted part of London by 2030, whether there's development or not, expansion or not. And it's worth noting that one extra runway would lead to 25 million extra road passenger journeys. And according to TfL, the cost of adapting our road networks is £15 billion more than Heathrow bosses have admitted. Just to put it in context, Heathrow expansion is incompatible with any prospect of meeting any legal air quality standards at all, and it simply needs to be removed from the agenda once and for all. Thank you, Mr. Crosby, for your indulgence.
Crosby, and thank you to my honourable friend for bringing this debate. I'm going to cover two issues, Heathrow and Mogden sewage works. I mentioned in my maiden speech the impact of Heathrow traffic on the A4 and the M4, both important corridors through my constituency. And how people experience air pollution isn't just the silent killer of respiratory illness and morbidity, but also you can see it when you put washing out on your cars, on your garden furniture, that greasy dirt. We know that the key pollutants around Heathrow are nitrogen dioxide and PM10. And as has already been said by previous speakers in this debate, the UK is already in breach of EU air quality legislation, and it's likely to continue to be in that case whether or not Heathrow is expanded. There are some feasible improvements, one that can be taken at Heathrow: cleaner planes, a kiss and drop scheme, increased public transport such as increased capacity on the Piccadilly line, crosswet rail, air track, and tunnelling, and of course has been mentioned tunnelling of the M4, which will just move the pollution. It's not going to actually decrease it. But the public transport improvements that are mentioned, the modal shift is not actually going to be very significant. And we're going to see, we already are seeing increased passengers at Heathrow even before additional runway capacity is built. There is no evidence that these changes are going to be adequate to meet the challenges of what will almost be doubling the air traffic movements should runway 3 or Heathrow Hub go ahead. More extreme measures have been suggested. Clean Air London talks about an ultra-low emission zone around Heathrow Airport. But to be effective, that zone would be so enormous, it would have a serious impact on the economy of the Thames Valley area and would be virtually impossible to enforce. So given what has been said by speakers before me, it's quite clear that on air quality grounds alone, expansion at Heathrow, whether it's Heathrow Hub or a third runway, cannot go ahead because of the breaches, the further breaches of EU air quality legislation that would imply. I'm going to move
onto a completely different area, but to local residents is certainly an air quality issue, and that is Mogden Sewage Works. I think it's the second largest sewage works in the UK, in the centre of my constituency. And for those who live near the sewage works in Twickenham and Hounslow South and in Isleworth, Twickenham, of course, not in my constituency, but they're very close to it. It's a almost weekly occurrence. I had 16 emails, complaints from residents near Mogden in my inbox yesterday. But we're going to host at Twickenham Rugby Stadium the Rugby World Cup in a couple of months, and there is a real risk that the UK could look rather embarrassing if many matches are spoilt by the stench of sewage floating over the stadium. And this is happening despite a 140 million expansion at Mogden Sewage Works last year, almost doubling the capacity of the works. I've been working for many years as a councillor with the campaign group MRAG and with council officers and indeed with our MPs before me to address this issue. And my predecessor, Mary MacLeod, came to see the Minister's predecessor, Dan Rogerson, to ask DEFRA to address the issue with some urgency. The storm tanks need covering. There need to be more storm tanks because, apart from the smell, Mogden is continuing to discharge dilute sewage into the Thames on a regular basis after every time there's heavy rain. So I will conclude, as I know time is very short today and others want to speak, by asking Mr Corsby if I could ask that the new Minister, meet me and local residents and local councillors to try and get a solution to this issue. Thank you very much.
Nick Hurd.
Thank you, Mr Corsby. I'll be very brief. If we're to get serious about improving air quality in London, then we must not lose sight of the ultimate no-brainer policy, which is to not willfully increase traffic on pollution hotspots. And if we're serious about improving air quality in the London Borough of Hillingdon, then the current plans for the construction of HS2 must be revisited. Very briefly, we are being asked to host multiple construction sites, some in existence for 10 years, which will flood narrow suburban roads with HGVs. These roads are already clogged. They're surrounded by high-density housing. It's home to clusters of schools with school children walking to school, and the impacts will be disastrous. Just to illustrate very briefly around 3 roads. Swakeley Roundabout, already highly congested and in breach of EU limits. The current HS2 plans will increase HGV traffic on this by 1672 HGV movements per day. Swakeley Road, 1860 HGV movements, new HGV movements per day. Harville Road, 1360 new HGV movements per day. To make that live a bit, that is a new HGV movement every 25 seconds on these roads that are key artery roads that my constituents use to get to work and to get around the borough. And this is an area where pollution levels are already high. And in some cases already in breach of EU limits. But the government plan through HS2 is to willfully increase traffic on these roads, on HS2's own traffic projections, fed into DEFRA's own forecasting model. Emissions for PM10, 25 and NOx will be set to rise by between 30 to 40%. And I just simply put it to the House and to you that this feels like irresponsible madness, given the threat that the Honourable Lady has articulated so well, the silent killer that she described, because this is government policy pulling in different directions. But there is a solution, Mr Crosby, which is to bury HS2, literally, by extending the proposed tunnel so that it goes across the Colne Valley. It can be done. Technically, the London Borough of Hillingdon report shows that it can be done for more or less the same price as the existing proposals. There's lots of reasons to do it, but today we simply add the opportunity for the government to avoid willfully adding to the terrible problem of the quality of air that Londoners breathe.
I'm going to call Mr Shepherd at 10:30 as the SNP spokesman. David Lammy.
I'll be very brief. Congratulate my honourable friend for securing this debate. She demonstrates what an effective parliamentarian she is and why she should stay in this House. I won't repeat the situation for pollution in London, of course, but except to say that apart from Oxford Street, Putney High Street, Brixton Road, these are areas that are heavily congested and have serious air pollution. Can I just mention schools? It is deeply worrying that with life expectancy reduced by 11 years, that so many London school kids are actually suffering with air pollution because so many parents are choosing to drive to school. There does need to be now a new initiative in London, with the Mayor leading it, encouraging parents to actually walk to school, both for the issue of obesity, but because so many engines outside school gates at both the beginning of the morning and the end and the end of the school day in the afternoon is causing real problem to our young people's lungs. And I know that the British Lung Foundation have had much to say on that. It's also important to do something about cycling. Clearly the budget needs to be increased. 1% of the TfL budget is not sufficient. There are real issues of cycling in suburban areas. We need to speed up superhighways. And at the moment, London's 40% ethnic minority population is not choosing to cycle. Alongside cycling proficiency that again must come back into schools, largely disappeared because the money has left local government. Unless we increase cycling, we will not make any progress, I'm afraid, in relation to air pollution. The electric car hire scheme that the Mayor announced has been a spectacular failure. He should learn from examples in Paris and over the coming year, but I would hope that the next Mayor, which of course I hope will be me, will do something about accelerating electric car use in the city. Crossrail 2 is hugely important in expanding our tube network and ensuring that people stay on the public underground system. And as chair of the all-party group on Crossrail 2, I would want to reiterate that it's important that as Crossrail 1 finishes, we move forward with Crossrail 2 in this city over the next horizon. Air pollution is bad, chronically bad. More needs to be done. Much has been said today about airport expansion. I will add nothing to that debate. Let's see what happens next week, except to say that in the end, most of it is down to diesel, and the next Mayor must address that in the congestion zone as well.
I'm now going to call the front benches. If you could divide the time evenly, and please give the Minister time at the end. With the new system, it does allow us to call the mover of the motion at the end. So, Tommy Shepherd.
Crosby. I speak on behalf of the third party in this debate, and perhaps at the beginning I should make it clear that the SNP is unlikely to have a candidate in the mayoral race that's coming up next year. But we are extremely pleased to be here today and to support the colleagues in London in raising awareness of this important issue. You can consider this one small step towards building the progressive alliance of which we have talked, which we hope will go across party and which we can be part of. I also should say that I used to be a resident of this city myself, and I have some affection for it. I lived here for 11 years, although that was some 20 years ago. And coming back to it, it is noticeable how much the city has improved in many ways, how much cleaner it appears to be on the outside, and how better things seem to be organised. But of course, what we are talking about here is the things that we cannot see. And I also have a personal interest because 5 years ago I was diagnosed as having asthma. So I know with other sufferers more than the average person that actually just because you can't see it doesn't mean it's not there and doesn't mean it's not doing you harm. There's very little I could find, in fact nothing I think I could find to disagree with in the comments that have been made by honourable members, and I very much support your ambition in trying to raise the profile of this debate. I think there are perhaps a couple of additional points I'd like to make. One is that, of course, and this applies not just in London, but across the United Kingdom, very particularly in Scotland itself, actually. We value very much the quality of our air and our reputation for having clean air, not just in terms of the residents who live in the city, but also of the people who would intend to visit it. Because if you start getting a reputation for having dirty air and being a polluted environment, then that reputational damage does have a long-term effect in terms of people wishing to visit and to spend time in our towns and cities. I'd also say also that we're going to start the debate this afternoon on the European Union and whether or not we should remain part of that union. If ever there was a response to the question, what has the European ever done for us, then I think it would be that it has set controls and limits to which we have to comply on air quality, because it's a simple recognition that the pollutants in our air do not respect administrative boundaries, whether they be within cities or within countries. And only by acting together and setting strict controls on emissions and the level of pollution can we protect our citizens across these boundaries. Now, I'm pleased to say, and I say this simply to inform the debate, that my colleagues in the Scottish Government and Scottish local authorities have been working very hard in this matter to try and improve the situation where we live. You will know that the UK, for the purposes of the compliance, is divided into 43 areas. There are 16 of those areas in the UK that are not in compliance at the moment and were meant to be by this year. Of those, I'm pleased to say that only one is in Scotland, and that is the Glasgow urban area, where we anticipate that by 2017 it will be in compliance when the current road is upgraded to motorway status as the completion of the M8 motorway. So we are doing our bit. We would be very supportive and want to support colleagues here in doing what you can to raise awareness and to implore action to be taken by government to improve the situation in London, and you can rely on our continued support.
Mr. Crosbie. I begin by congratulating my honourable friend for initiating this timely debate. She has laid down a serious challenge to both the Mayor of London and to the government. The Mayor of London, of course, has a dual role now as the honourable member for Uxbridge and South Ruislip, and I hope that his new responsibilities may be leading him to seriously question the adequacy of some of the measures that he proposed as Mayor to tackle air pollution in this great city. In his constituency, the children at Pinkwell Primary School and at Cherry Lane Primary School are facing carcinogenic air pollution that is twice the annual legal limit. We know that children attending primary schools within 150 metres of a main road are growing up with lung capacity impaired by up to a third. We know that such children have increased risk of asthma and heart disease. Indeed, this afternoon I will be hosting an event with other members with the Healthy Air campaign precisely to highlight these risks and to encourage honourable members to press for real and urgent change. The impact of air pollution on London's children is shocking. We know from Public Health England that London's toxic air has already caused over 1,300 premature deaths this year. That is the poorest children, though, that it is the poorest children, though, who are worst affected, should make us feel particularly ashamed. Those least able to defend themselves are most exposed to the danger. In Britain, health inequality has become inseparable from environmental inequality, and those who live in the most polluted environment are quite simply the poor. No one would choose to live or go to school on a dangerously polluted road. Those who do usually do not have a choice in the matter. They're forced to live with the risks. But government does have a choice, and it also has a responsibility. 3 years the government spent in court trying to wriggle out of that responsibility placed upon them by Annex 15, Section B of Article 23(1) of the Air Quality Directive. They argued that there was no requirement on them under the directive to prepare a plan to improve the situation. The judgment was absolutely precise, however, about the seriousness of the breach. In fact, they ruled, and I quote, "The new government should be left in no doubt as to the need for immediate action, which is achieved by an order that new plans must be delivered to the Commission not later than 31st December 2015. The government revealed in court that they did not believe they would solve air pollution under their plans until 2030. Particulate matter alone is currently responsible for over 3,000 deaths a year in London. When the Committee on the Medical Effects of Air Pollution is finally allowed to report its findings on nitrogen dioxide next month, it is estimated that that figure could double. A conservative estimate, therefore, would suggest that by 2030, the government's failure to tackle air pollution could, on its own lights, see the death of more than 50,000 Londoners. In the words of the judgment, the Secretary of State has, I quote, an obligation to act urgently under Article 23(1) in order to remedy a real and continuing danger to public health as soon as possible. Government and the Mayor have been playing a mutually convenient blame game. Last year, the government wrote to every local authority where air pollution exceeded legal limits to explain that ultimate legal responsibility for air pollution lay with local authorities, and that any fines levied on the government would be passed on to the local authorities. The Supreme Court judgment shows that this letter was wrong. So I asked the Minister, in the light of that judgment, will the government now be sending a correction letter to all of those local authorities? But the Minister is not the only one here today who needs to send out a correction letter. Over the weekend, I received a briefing from the Mayor of London on air quality in London for today's debate. I'm sorry he couldn't be here. My office questioned his earlier on and found that he was attending an LBC pre-record, which clearly took priority. In bold type, it tells me, this briefing note, London does not have the worst air pollution on the planet. Oh, well, we must all be very well relieved at that. Actually, a presentation at the Environmental Research Group at King's College London last year by Dr. David Carslaw suggests otherwise. The annual mean NO2 measured continuously in Oxford Street was 135 micrograms per metre cubed. World Health Organization guidelines state that the average should not be more than 40. The WHO also state that the NO2 level should not rise above 200 micrograms per metre cube for more than 18 hours in a single year. Oxford Street recorded levels above 200 micrograms, not for 18 hours, but for 1,502 hours in a single year. The Mayor's briefing is careful to talk only about average annual levels of nitrogen dioxide. Dr. Carslaw is quite explicit when he refers to both the Oxford Street figures. I quote him, "To my knowledge, this level is the highest in the world in terms of both hourly and annual means." But of course, as so often with the Mayor, he has used distraction technique. This is not some perverse international contest. My pollution is bigger than yours. The real issue here is that the average annual NO2 level in London's busiest street was more than 4 times higher than the World Health Organization says it should be. It exceeded the maximum permissible hourly spikes by more than 8,344%. That's the issue. And no amount of international comparison can render that acceptable. The mayoral briefing claims that since 2008, when he took office, there has been a 12% reduction in nitrogen dioxide. Well, by my reckoning, that still leaves us with a very long way to go. The mayoral briefing says that London is implementing the most ambitious package of measures of any world city. It cites the ultra-low emission zones as proof of this. Well, I'm sorry that the mayor doesn't consider either Berlin or Copenhagen to be a world city. Here, low-emission zones have already dramatically reduced air pollution. But the truth is that London's proposed ultra-low-emission zone will not come into effect until 2020. Even then, will only apply in the central congestion charging zone and will only cover 7% of London's main roads that suffer the worst nitrogen dioxide pollution. It will exempt buses from meeting the highest Euro 6 standard, and it will only require that all new taxis are zero emissions capable by 2030. 93% of the most polluted roads in London will be outside the zone and may in fact experience greater pollution as vehicles circumvent the area and move the pollution into more residential and poorer parts of the city. If ever there were a perfect example of the phrase too little, too late, this is surely it. I give way briefly to my honourable friend.
Just congratulate my honourable friend, he's absolutely demolishing the current mayor's record on this issue, which is atrocious. Perhaps he'd like to think about standing for position himself. I understand we've only heard 2 pitches for the post, but 3 now. So we will see.
Enough already. Enough. Look, with cities across Europe adopting low and ultra-low emission zones, there is a huge prize for the manufacturers of low emissions vehicles. There are also very significant risks to manufacturers that choose to bet against that trend. A responsible government would reduce this risk by adopting the highest standards here, today. Can the Minister tell us what progress has been made to establish long-term goals and timescales for a step-by-step rebalancing of fuel duty and vehicle excise duty, consistent with reducing not just CO2 emissions, but also NO2 and particulate matter impacts? Emissions-based pricing must be the way forward. To achieve this, I'm asking today the Minister to initiate a strategic assessment of the relative benefits of the different options to encourage the manufacture and purchase of low and ultra-low emissions vehicles. On one point, the Mayor's document is certainly correct, however. Government and the EU need to take complementary action and work with local authorities like TfL to create a national framework of low-emission zones, to accelerate the uptake of zero-emissions vehicles, and to ensure that the Euro 6 standard does not reproduce the mistakes of Euro 4 and 5, where the actual performance under road conditions is vastly inferior to test conditions. The trouble for the Minister is that his government's own reports show that far from trying to improve the standards, they have been working to undermine these very EU air pollution regulations since 2012. Chairman, I do assure you that I have not got the date wrong when I inform the House that it was on the 1st of April 2015 that the government announced that as part of its red tape challenge, it was working in Europe to undermine the enforcement of the air pollution regulation. I quote them, working in partnership with other member states, negotiate to, reduce the risk of financial penalties from non-compliance, especially in relation to nitrogen dioxide provisions. Somewhat ironically, the paragraph ends with the words, whilst maintaining or improving health and ecosystem protection. The Minister is no fool. I respect him greatly. He must recognise that there is actually a causal relationship here. You cannot introduce amendments to the Air Quality Directive that raise the permitted limits of nitrogen dioxide and improve public health at the same time. The government needs to wake up and take responsibility for this public health crisis. It was extensive lobbying efforts by environmental and health organisations that persuaded this government and the European Commission to abandon efforts to dilute the Clean Air Directive. This means the new minister now has an opportunity to start with a clean slate. I ask him in his summing up if he will commit here today to drop all objections to current European standards unless they are on the basis that those standards are too weak, and to work to increase air quality in Europe, in the UK, and in London. And if he will not, will he answer one final question? What is the point of a government that cannot and will not deliver clean air for its citizens?
Minister, well, it's a great, great privilege to have my first opportunity to speak in Westminster Hall on this subject. There's a fantastic attendance, and I wanted to begin by paying tribute to the Honourable Member for Hackney North and Stoke Newington for bringing this debate. She very eloquently expressed many of the reasons why this is such a deeply important problem. Partly because, as she says, that it's an invisible substance, it's the air we breathe, and indeed I'd also like particularly to welcome the Honourable Member for Edinburgh East, who I think spoke very powerfully about his experience both as somebody who's an asthmatic, but also made a great contribution in the debate in terms of bringing brevity and common sense to this discussion and issue. Poor air quality is an incredibly serious issue. As the Honourable Member for Hackney North and Stoke Newington pointed out, it isn't simply an invisible substance, it's the very heart of our breathing, of our organic matter, and these are processes we're only just beginning to understand. I wanted just very quickly just to pick up on 2 points of fact, but basically, of course, I have a lot of sympathy for her argument. 2 small points of fact, perhaps simply just to frame the debate. One of them is that the notion that when the Honourable Member was growing up, the air quality in London was somehow better than it is today, and that the reason why there's childhood asthma is that the air quality has declined since the Honourable Member was young, is not actually the case. There are significant challenges around air quality today in London, but it is important to bear in mind, as indeed the Honourable Member for Edinburgh East pointed out, that actually it's improved very significantly. Since 1970 alone, PM is down by 70%, nitrogen dioxide levels are down by 62% since 1970. So there is an enormous amount still to do, but we shouldn't get ourselves into a worldview of believing that somehow it's worse today than it was in the past. Things have been improving. We should be working to make them improve more quickly. Again, we don't, and this again may sound like a petty point, but we don't spend actually £16 billion a year on health costs dealing with these issues. That £16 billion estimate is an estimate on social costs. The actual amount spent on health care costs related to this is approximately 1/100th of that amount. So again, it's worth framing simply not because there aren't significant health costs. There are indeed significant health costs, possibly running even into the hundreds of millions. But in thinking about the public policy implications, we don't want a £16 billion figure in lights. Again, she also raised issues around carbon footprint. That again raises another major complexity which was raised by the Honourable Member, which is the relationship between the ways in which engines emit carbon and the way in which engines emit nitrogen dioxide. I just want to touch again very, very briefly on the many honourable and right honourable members who've spoken in this debate. To pick up on Ealing Central and Acton, and the issue particularly around Horn Lane. Again, a highly complex issue. We have a series of different industrial plants operating in Horn Lane. There is a cement works, there's a waste transfer station. All of this increases the amount of particulate matter in the atmosphere in Horn Lane. There are mitigating factors that could be introduced. They range from walls to include the particulate matter to cleaning the tyres of vehicles moving in and out of those stations. There are some technical issues which Transport for London has been looking at and which indeed Ealing Council has been looking at. These have included using bus lanes in order to move road cleaning vehicles more readily. We've offered government support to the council if they're interested in applying for those road cleaning vehicles. It is a very serious issue, but I think we have a clearer idea on what the mitigating factors could be. I'd like to encourage the Honourable Member to work with me to put pressure on the council to make sure that we bring those measures in. Please, by all means. Yeah.
Problem that local authorities are sort of punished by EU fines if they don't meet these targets, but they don't actually have the power to do anything about it. And we did have in our manifesto that we would have devolved spending £30 billion of money behind this, and at the moment that's not happening. I wondered if the Minister has any plans to do anything like that.
In this particular issue, in direction to Horn Lane, I'm afraid I slightly disagree. I think there is perhaps, without being too controversial about this, a little bit more that the local authority might have been able to do. For example, there were government grants available, for example, for road sweeping equipment, which I personally would have liked the council to apply for. I think there perhaps could have been more imagination and flexibility around the issue of the bus lane and the road sweeping equipment, but I'm very happy to take that up in more detail with the Honourable Member. The Honourable Member for Hayes and Harlington, again, I would be absolutely delighted to meet with himself and members of his constituency in order to talk through the very specific issues related to plants in his constituency. In relation to the Honourable Member from the cities of London and Westminster, a fantastic statement of the good context of London, first city of the world in the 19th century, first city to industrialise, first post-industrial city. In particular, I think colleagues in the Department of Transport should be very interested in the specific proposals made around taxis. We're very grateful for the Honourable Member and very happy to talk about those. Speed humps, I think, is an important issue again, which is worth looking at. And also, I would like to pay tribute to the tribute that he paid to his constituent who's led this campaign with Clean Air London. The Honourable Member for Carshalton Willington, Again, very striking statistics on awareness in schools. Some very good ideas, I thought, on communications and the way in which we could work on better communications around this issue. He raised a question on whether total ambient emissions are reflected in permissions. My understanding from officials is total ambient emissions are indeed reflected in those guidances. If you discover a specific issue, your constituency where they're not, by all means come back to me so that we can follow up on that. But they should indeed address total ambient emissions. Yeah.
Thank you very much for giving way and for responding to that point. My understanding is that when the Environment Agency
look at emissions from a particular plant, all they can do is look at the extra emissions from that plant against the background level. They cannot take into account the totality of emissions related to a number of plants in an area which might actually exceed permitted levels of pollution.
Okay. Well, very, very happy to follow this up in more detail. It's possible there's a distinction here between the responsibilities of the Environment Agency, which, as the Honourable Member knows, focuses on industrial plants, and the responsibility of my department, of our department, DEFRA, which focuses on air quality in general. But I'm very happy to take up this particular issue. The Honourable Member for Richmond Park raised a number of very important issues. I like very striking example of 2 extra tube trains a week coming into London in terms of population growth, the emphasis on increasing use of the river, although, of course, there are issues even around pollutants from riverborne vehicles, which account for a substantial percent of the nitrogen dioxide emissions in London. The question of electric cars, I think, has to be central. If there's a single technology which can address so many of these issues, not only in terms of air pollutants and public health, but also in terms of carbon emissions, it has to be electric cars. I think the government has taken 4 measures which are quite striking on electric cars, ranging from working with Formula E to providing incentives to electric car manufacturers to locate in the West Midlands, through to looking at charging points and possible motorway charging points for electric vehicles on the move. But I agree this is the most exciting area, and an area where it would be fantastic to work with the Honourable Member to push us harder, challenge us to do more around electric vehicles. Which I believe, unless I'm missing central things, bring us to the Honourable Member, one quick pause, of Brentford and Isleworth, who raised the issue of the Mogden sewage works, and particularly the storm tanks and the quantity of those storm tanks and the covering of those storm tanks. Again, very delighted to take up the request to meet with herself and her constituents. We hope, of course, that if we're lucky enough to get the Thames Tideway Tunnel through, this may be able to deal with some of these factors. But the Honourable Member reckons it won't, so I'm very happy to give way to her. Yep.
Thank you very much. The Mogden sewage works is upstream of the proposed Tideway Tunnel and therefore is not included in the proposals, so it will have no impact. It will, at the current capacity, Mogden will still be discharging dilute sewage into the Thames.
Okay. Well, I clearly have a lot to learn from the Honourable Member about Mogden sewage works, so I look forward to having a conversation with officials in detail about that issue. The Honourable Member for Islip, Northwood and Pinner particularly raised the question of HGV movements. Again, a very striking statistics, HGV movements, which he estimates is happening every 25 seconds under the proposals for HS2. There's great sense of what we should literally do. He used the phrases, bury HS2. Again, very, very happy to look at those issues in detail. It is, however, an illustration as we walk through this debate of the incredible number of challenges around pollutants and air pollution in London. Many of these measures are, as the Honourable Member for Hayes and Harlington pointed out, issues that, in many ways, we wish to support. HS2 has considerable potential environmental benefits if it can move people out of vehicles, but at the same time, in the process of its construction, it can create immense problems around air pollution in London. The Honourable Member for Tottenham, who I thought produced a wonderful broadcast for his campaign to be mayor, said something which I think very, very difficult to disagree with, and we very much like to get behind, which is the question around people driving to school and encouraging parents and children to walk to school. It's always, of course, easier said than done, perhaps, but the reality is that that will, as you say, not simply address issues around obesity and public health, but also those idling engines outside school. are precisely emitting nitrogen dioxides at an extraordinary intensity. And addressing that, I think, is a very sensible thing to do. Again, investment in cycling seems very sensible. There are some quite impressive and startling statistics produced by TfL on the increase in the number of people cycling over the last 5 years, but I'm sure the Honourable Member is correct that there is more that can be done. I've mentioned, yes, of course. Yeah.
Would the Minister agree with me that sustained investment in public transport is essential to deal not only with congestion in London but air quality? I'm thinking in the context of strategic river crossings in East London, where if we're to see any investment in extra roads, often taken by some as a panacea for congestion and air quality, we need to, at a minimum, see sustained investment in public transport so we continue that modal shift of people out of private vehicles and onto public transport.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's absolutely right. And I think these are issues of incredibly complex modelling. And as the Honourable Member implies, the construction of a new bridge raises a whole series of new issues. Absolutely, investment in public transport is essential, and I think TfL takes that on board. To come to the Opposition Minister, Right Honourable Member for Brent North, a number of very, very striking arguments put forward. Don't want to get too much into the details of the argument about exactly whether Oxford Street where it stands in international rankings. As the Right Honourable Member pointed out, there are a number of issues, both in terms of hourly measurement and mean average estimate. As somebody who lived in Kabul, in Afghanistan, of 3.5 years, I would find it difficult to believe the particulate matters in Oxford Street are higher than those that we were experiencing in Kabul. But of course, as the Right Honourable Member points out, the more legitimate comparison is with developed European cities, where, of course, we need to make sure that London is moving in the right direction. The issues around fuel duty, excise duty, and nitrogen dioxides, and emission-based pricing in general, are again very important. The Right Honourable Member would not expect me at this stage to preempt the Treasury or start disrupting markets by talking about those kind of fiscal instruments, but clearly, as part of looking at a panoply of responses to emissions, the Right Honourable Member is absolutely correct that logically that is one thing that a responsible government should be investigating. The subject of European standards, I think, was raised both by the Right Honourable Member and also by the Honourable Member for Edinburgh East. It is, of course, correct that we do owe a debt of gratitude in many ways to Europe for holding us to account, and indeed not just us, but 17 other European countries which are currently in breach of their nitrogen dioxide thresholds. We should then, just to move to a conclusion, recognise that this is an issue which has faced London since the beginning of the 19th century. We need to recognise that, of course, in many ways, the issues we face with today are the end of nearly 200 years of struggling with these issues. As early as 1813, particles of carbon, dust, and even fecal matter were so thick in the streets of London it wasn't possible to see across the street. As the Honourable Member for Richmond Park pointed out, the smog in December 1952 managed to kill 4,000 people in just 4 days. That's where we're coming from in London. Since then, we've severely restricted coal burning in central London. We've introduced catalytic converters on vehicles. We've reduced sulfur dioxide emissions by 88%. We've reduced our particulate matter by 70%. We've reduced nitrogen dioxide by 62% since 1970. Particulate matter is now below the EU-defined threshold. But there is, of course, as Honourable and Right Honourable Members have pointed out, much more to be done. Yes, of course.
Very thorough answer to all the points, but many members raised the issue of Heathrow, and I wonder if he would address that point directly. What concerns does the government have about air pollution at Heathrow, particularly in the light of its possible expansion?
The responsibility of DEFRA, and I am slightly evading this issue because I'm not going to take a grand stance on Heathrow, but as the Honourable Member is aware, the responsibility of DEFRA is indeed to police air quality and air pollution in London, and we will continue to exercise our responsibilities, says he, evading the issue. I was particularly struck by the Honourable Member from Richmond Park focusing on non-road mobile machinery and the potential that is there to reduce emissions potentially by up to 40% on non-road mobile machinery. It is worth looking at that. And indeed, again, on domestic and industrial boilers. We've focused a lot on vehicle movements today, but there is potential in other areas. I'm personally disappointed, although I do agree with the Right Honourable Member Brent North that Europe has done a great deal, but I am personally disappointed that 3 weeks ago we were not able to get other European member states to address the issue of the fact that the current Euro 6 engines are not performing outside a laboratory. If we could get agreement on that, it would make a huge difference. So, while some progress has been made, each new step we are dealing with is becoming progressively more and more difficult. We're not dealing simply with one issue, such as diesel cars. We are dealing with a dozen different issues, all of which are contributing almost equally to diesel emissions. Very little time, but yes.
One final time, just on the question of air quality strategy, I hope I didn't miss it, and I hope he isn't being evasive, but when will the government publish its air quality strategy?
Minister. I don't have an answer for him on that. I'm very happy to sit down and talk through the details. We certainly are bringing together an air quality strategy, but I don't have a date for the Honourable Member. To conclude, there are dozens of measures that we need to take. This is a highly complex issue, but I'm very, very open to ideas from anybody here in the room on how we can improve this extraordinarily important issue. We face enormous challenges of scientific prediction, and as London addresses these issues, we should also be certain to share that best practice with other countries around the world.
Order.